Heavenly Father, as we gather today to work on the business of the city, we invite you to join us and to lead us and guide us. Lord, your word says, in the abundance of counsel, there's wisdom. And I thank you, Father, for our counsel and the feedback and the insight. And we ask, Lord, today that you give us wisdom, that we would operate not in our wisdom, but in your wisdom. So we just invite you to join this meeting and to guide us and lead us as you always do. And we ask God for your blessing to be upon our city. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, let's start with roll call.
Rodriguez,
Here.
Bruner,
Here.
Mucci, Levi,
Present.
Haverfield,
Here.
Bauer. Bauer,
Here.
So the first item on the agenda today is an action item, and this is to approve participation in the governor's public safety. Mike, sorry, I forgot to pull my mic down, so I'm going to say that again. This morning, our first item on the agenda is to approve participation in the governor's public safety initiative and the property tax relief proposal. And as we step into this, we're going to start this morning and have Finance Director Doug Racine share some information that he's put into it. I think the comment I want to make as we begin this discussion is that, first and foremost, Finance Director Doug Racine has spent a tremendous amount of time reviewing this, considering it. We've been in countless phone calls and discussions and meetings, and this has been a really difficult decision. It's not an easy decision because our heart is to provide tax relief to the citizens. But we also have to take into consideration the potential impact of that decision and where we can really stand behind what we're committing to as we would accept this and move forward with it. So with that, that's why we pray for wisdom, because we need to know what the right decision is. And as we start, I will say some cities are participating and some cities are not. Canyon County is not, Caldwell is not, and the small cities in Canyon County, a little bit like CUNA, because they don't have their own public safety and it's outsourced, their participation it's not there because it's through the county. So Ada County, I believe, is participating, Meridian, Boise. I don't know all the other cities, but across the state, some are in, some are not in. And those that are not in many times are for similar reasons. So today we're going to talk about it, and we're going to have Doug present and share with us what all he knows. And then we want to be able to answer whatever questions that council may have, and we'll make a decision. Doug, thank you.
Mayor and councilors, I want to be clear this morning. My objective this morning is to share with you the information that I have gathered and studied so that you can make an informed decision. I will try to keep my opinions primarily to myself, except if they are specifically finance related, and then they are finance related, not from any broader perspective, but just how I would look at this from finance, not from just a city perspective. So understand where I'm coming from there. To give you the information and to give you the guidance that I see as a finance leader in the city. Mark, is that? So the mayor indicated that there were several cities participating and several not. I do know, just for background as we go through this, that the larger cities participating have resources that we do not. And we'll get to the end of this and that will come into play. Well, let's start back at the beginning. let's see. Mark asked me to change the page. Okay, go to the next page, please. Okay. Governor Little signed an executive order back on August 6, 2020, that served as the basis for this issue where we find ourselves now. The intent was to leverage CARES monies, 188 million specifically, to provide relief to, how should I put this? There are multiple ways to look at this. The description is this is a public safety initiative where they are intending to fund public safety labor, with a condition that the savings be passed on through the L2 to reduced tax burdens to the citizen. That's probably, remember that one, that's condition one where it was a challenge that has been challenged. So, without spending too much time on this slide, the executive order kicked this ball off to the point where we had been negotiating and working for the last probably 2 months to try and figure out what this really means. Let's go to the next slide. This letter, the mayor kindly forwarded to me just a couple of days ago, was issued to the Deputy Inspector General. It comes from the National Governors Association, GFOA, National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, United States Conference of Mayors, National Conference of State Legislators, and the Council of State Government. I think there's maybe one more I missed. There were 7 in total. And it summarizes very nicely the accounting aspects of this problem. The guidelines in CFAC say that any funds we use for reimbursement must be substantially for the support of COVID-19. There are 3 basic requirements. One, we have to spend the money between March 1st and December 30th. It cannot be for a budgeted event, meaning if it's already been budgeted for, we can't apply for relief. And 3, that must be substantially dedicated or caused by the COVID-19. So it must be in response to COVID-19. Now, the guidelines were also included a statement that indicated that for payroll, there are certain circumstances where payroll can be a reimbursable expense. And on those contents, it means that the payroll must be substantially dedicated to the service of COVID-19, or in substantially different context, that it was a different type of labor. So that was our first hurdle, because the public safety labor includes all of fire and police. But you can't with clear conscience say that every cost within fire and every cost within police is dedicated to the relief of COVID-19. So we come up with one conundrum there that was addressed in a recent letter from the Treasury, where it says in the bottom line here, how does the government determine whether payroll expenses for a given employee satisfy the substantially dedicated condition? And the response was, in the underlined section of the second paragraph, a state, territorial, local, or tribal government may presume that payroll costs for public health and public safety employees are payments for services substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to COVID-19 public emergency health. The only exception to that was if the CEO of the city, the mayor, deemed that to be otherwise. Now, this gives us a presumption to kind of hide behind in an aspect where we could say that the public safety labor is entirely dedicated to the COVID-19 relief. Let's go on to the next page.
Doug, council members don't have this copy. Were we to have provided? Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I printed off copies.
And I will say, as you're doing that, we have 3 council members on Teams, and so they do not have this, so they'll just have to listen well
Okay, all right.
and watch our screen.
So on page 4 of this presentation, the letter to the Deputy Inspector General continues. And here's where one of two major conflicts arises. We have two sections of the government working against each other, not working against each other, but seemingly at odds within each other. The Treasury Department and the OIG, the Office of Inspector General. The Treasury Department says you can presume public labor is substantially dedicated to the service of COVID-19. Treasury's okay, you're okay, go ahead and do it. OIG says the following in a FAQ that came out on August 28th, or actually August 10th, with three main sections. We're talking about section 69, 69A, and 69B. And this is where we get hung up. 69 states, reporting requirements include, but are not limited to, general and subsidiary ledgers used to account for and the receipt of CRF payments and subsequent disbursements, payroll time and human resource records, support costs incurred in payroll expenses related to addressing COVID-19 health emergencies. That's not so onerous because we keep track. We can do that. That's not a problem. But you move to 69A and B. A states that recipient governments, including cities, will have to demonstrate and substantiate that an employee's function and duties were in fact substantially dedicated to mitigating the emergency. And in 69B, similarly requires that recipient governments to demonstrate and substantiate that the duties and functions of an employee substantially dedicate to mitigating the emergency that are also a substantially different use. So we have two different sets, and I think Mark addressed this in the last session. We have a conflict here where the Treasury says you may presume it's substantially dedicated to the COVID-19, and the OIG, which has the power to ask for these funds back, says you must substantiate and prove that they actually were part of, dedicated to the service of COVID-19. So the crux of the letter on page 5 was to request, and this is still at this stage a request, it has not been resolved. At a minimum, we request that the OIG's reporting requirement of 69, 69A, and 69B be prospective from August 28th. This will provide fair warning to prime recipients and subgrantees. We are a subgrantee, the state is the prime recipient. And we want to come back and visit that again in just a minute. The subgrantees alike, the rules or standards of what they must adhere to. So what they're trying to say is, give people fair warning before they know what's going to happen, before August 28th. But then they continue in the second paragraph, while this is the minimum request, we would prefer that you fully withdraw questions 69, 69A, and 69B from your FAQ. So you have some very well-known institutions asking for clarity because you've got, and this is, keep in mind, this applies across the country, but I'm talking about a state issue. So there's more, this is more to do across the country than just Idaho, but it has direct bearing on us here in Idaho with regard to this particular aspect of the CARES Act. So I have shared and discussed this information with our auditors, Ed Bailey. Particularly the Treasury guidance that indicates that we may presume. The reason we discussed it is because of what Mark alluded to was the compliance audit, the Single Audit Act. Just to give you a little bit of a background of what a single audit is, I used to do these in my former life, so I know very well, I've done this. It is a compliance audit. If you're out of compliance $1, you are out of compliance. It is a federal audit. They're very, very picky. They do not have to, they apply laws of materiality, but when we're talking about $10, $11 million, this is material, all right? So let me give you just a possible worst case scenario. If we receive these funds and we use them as prescribed by the state, the auditors will then audit this as part of our single largest federal grant of the year. In the past, that would have been CDBG or money to the fire department of maybe $700,000 to $1 million. This would be when you consider the CFAC funds of possibly $3.3 million and this of about $9 million, they would definitely audit this. The question I had for them is where would they land on the discussion of those 69A and B requirements? Because if they landed on those and found that we did not substantially demonstrate the purpose was COVID related, they could give us a finding. They have multiple options. They could do a management letter just saying, hey, this probably wasn't the best thing, don't do it again, which is fine. We could deal with that. They could give an immaterial finding, which is also probably acceptable because you as a council would know where that came from. It was just following guidance. But if they pursue a material finding on the single audit, that could adversely affect our ability to garner future federal funds. Because anybody that provides us future federal funds from any source will see that we have had a negative material finding. And at that point, it raises their red flags, and they go, well, if they got a problem, I don't know if I want to give them money. That's worst case scenario. Based on the discussion with the auditors and the prescription and the presumption that the Treasury got, the auditors came out and kind of said, this sounds like it might be okay. They didn't give me a guarantee, but they kind of said this might be okay. And they felt a little degree of comfort with that. It's as close as I was going to get to a commitment from them. So on this aspect, we're probably able to go down the road, and if we have a management letter or an immaterial finding, I'm not going to worry about it. I don't think you should worry about it. There is still the possibility they could give us a material negative finding. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's the first critical issue. And before I go through this slide, I want to address, and Mark may have to join me on this one, the other aspect. In fact, I'm going to go through this slide and then I'll bring that in because it will give you perspective. When we first generated our payroll and our public safety labor cost, we put everything in. We took the entire public safety labor for police and fire and submitted that to state. We received back a credit of $11.181 million. That's what they would allow us in total funding. Then based on the substantially dedicated and proof, we said, let's go back on this and let's pare out all the things that are likely to be questioned. So investigative services, criminalists, people that have funding from other sources, so there's no double dipping. So we scaled it back. We pulled about $6 million worth of labor out, and the credit decreased, or the funding decreased to $9.249 million. So we took it down almost $2 million by being more in keeping with the spirit of what the substantially dedicated meant. Now, there are two aspects of this funding that are really important to understand. When we take this money, it will be passed through our L2. The L2 will reduce the levy rate substantially. The levy rate for urban renewal will also decrease. So in order to keep the urban renewal whole, the state devised a pass-through mechanism that would take $605,000 of the $9.2 million, and we would cut a check to urban renewal to keep them whole. And we're going to come back to that. The second aspect is that we are allowed by the state program to retain 3% as an administrative cost. That's $277,000. Those funds would come to us as the city for us to use for all the work we've done in trying to cover this. We did not ask for the 3%. We did not calculate the 3%. It was given to us. Everybody that participates in this program will get the 3%. So that means the bottom line that if we chose to participate, $8.361 million would be passed through in reduced tax levies to the L2. So instead of issuing an assessment at $45 million, we'd have an assessment roughly $38 million. So you'd have a decrease of maybe 20%. Now, without leaving this page, I want to come back to the urban renewal. That was a discussion the mayor and I had yesterday, and Mark and I had yesterday, that talks about the legality of issuing a check to urban renewal. One of the items that is very clearly proscribed in this process and in this bill is revenue replacement. We cannot take any CARES funds and use it to replace revenues of any sort. I can't take it for myself. If a small business grant applies to us for lost revenues, I can't give it to them. But this program, many will say, is replacing lost property tax revenues at the urban renewal by cutting a check from us to them. There's a budgetary authority issue I would also have to work through. But I think I'd like, Mark, if you can comment more on the discussion we had yesterday, because the state gave a rationale for why this wasn't revenue replacement, and it seemed a bit complex. May, are you okay with that if he talks about this? Or?
I am, and I do just want to make a quick comment. As Doug has shared today, it may sound like he's sharing some legality things. We've had a lot of discussions, but Doug is representing, not representing on behalf of Mark any legal issues.
No.
What Doug is sharing today is his process of thinking through where do we go with this? This is something that he's taken serious consideration, had a lot of discussions on. So I just wanted to make it clear,
Right, thank you.
he's not representing legal on these issues, but he's representing from a finance perspective and really thinking about it, because operationally, he's the one that this is gonna land on his desk,
It does.
right? If there's a finding, it's a reflection. On Doug is our finance director, and that's not something, I'm concerned about that, because we certainly don't want to create a negative situation for him personally because of a finding. But really, it's from substantiating the amount of work and really thinking through the process that Doug's going to have to go through, because he's been doing this with every reimbursement we've submitted to the state. And it's well documented, it's very seriously considered, and that's what he's spending a tremendous amount of time on. And this is just a really big one. So you're getting to hear from Doug, and he's not intending to represent the legal side, he's representing,
Which is why I want Mark to speak more
Exactly.
specifically to that aspect of it. So,
yeah?
Mayor,
for the
Thank
urban
you.
renewal, please, could you want to share with this one?
just, before you start, Mark, just for clarification purposes, when you say you've documented COVID expenses, that has been to this point, but it didn't include any labor costs, any of those things, which is what we're talking about today.
We have a small degree of labor costs we have documented and submitted for reimbursement. They are separate from this. For instance, Chief Carpenter's payroll from March 1st to now, since he's been substantially dedicated, is
Right.
reimbursable. And other instances, but we have not done anything with public safety other than what might be in the DOJ grant that we approved earlier.
Which is what I understood going in, is that we have had some actual costs. What we're talking about today is potential receipt of additional funding for labor expenses. So, and at the end of this, I'll ask my questions, but I just wanted clarity on the fact that we've already documented a lot of things. Is that what
Yes.
you're talking about, that he's documented?
We have documented our
Yes.
COVID expenses, and those expenses that have been submitted for reimbursement are outside of this. We made sure we pulled everything out, and that's why that number dropped.
So did we
Right,
already
2 million.
receive funds?
We have not received, we just submitted 3 bills this week, and I have more bills. We just submitted 3 requests this week, and I have 2 more to go, in fact, 3 more to go this week, that will, in fact, have some of these funds in there. We have 2, one for Chief Carpenter for his payroll, and another for the police overtime that we'll be submitting. And then there have been other little labor pieces throughout, but by and large, those are the 2 single.
Right, items that weren't initially budgeted.
Right.
So what is the total value of, do you think, of those items that we can substantiate?
The other items?
Yes.
Well, I don't know, the police labor, 15, I think that's maybe about 50,000.
Okay.
And I don't really want to divulge Kirk's
Too much?
salary, so 6 months of Kirk's salary.
Okay, so that's all been quantified. So now as we
Yeah.
go forward, it's whether we accept this additional funding.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Mark on this one.
Good morning, Mayor and Council. To address just real briefly this issue with respect to urban renewal reimbursement, when the governor originally created the program, one of the component parts, well, there were kind of 2 component parts. One was receiving the CARES Act funding to provide for police and fire payroll, right? That was the large part of it. But there was also this component part where you could keep urban renewal whole. That was the language out of the governor's initial order. My understanding is the way that initially looked was they were going to give you the payroll money, and they were going to give you the money that you needed in order to reimburse urban renewal. But there were questions raised about that were different than the police and fire, okay? And Doug has done a good job of articulating the language out of the CARES Act and the language out of the guidance that talks about whether or not those police and fire expenses were budgeted, whether or not they were substantially different from what was anticipated, and how that plays in with the presumption, okay? There is no presumption available, and there is no language in the CARES Act, and there is no language in the guidance that makes it okay to use CARES Act money to replace lost revenue for urban renewal. So it's a different issue, and it's a little bit, in my mind, it's a lot clearer than the use of CARES Act funds to pay police and fire salaries. The CARES Act specifically says you cannot use the funds for revenue replacement, which is what this would be. So as that discussion progressed, the governor's office changed its position on that. The way I understand it now, and Doug's seen the L2, the way it's set up to do this is they're still providing an avenue for reimbursing urban renewal. What you would do then is only receive CARES Act funding for the police and fire payroll. And then the credit that you're required to pass along to the taxpayers would not be for that entire amount. It would be for that amount less the amount of money needed to make urban renewal whole, which you would still collect then through property taxes because you're not giving the full credit to the taxpayers. The city would receive that money from the taxpayers and then turn around and pay to make the urban renewal agency whole. That cities are specifically authorized to fund urban renewal out of their general fund. It's a public purpose. And so with this mechanism, as I talked to Doug, it sounds like, you still got CARES Act running around with a payment to urban renewal that would be unusual. And while that might be true, I think really all you're doing is collecting tax dollars and then paying that over to urban renewal, which is appropriate under Idaho law. So we need to make sure that we're not going to use CARES Act dollars through this governor's program to repay urban renewal. We just need to make sure we do it the right way.
Mayor?
Yes.
So question mark, actually I got a couple, but if at the end of the day, there's a complaint that comes against the city for misappropriation of the receipt of these funds as it's refunded back to urban renewal, would the Economic Development Office, would the Napa Development Corporation, would the mayor and city council all be subject to potentially being brought in as, I guess, witnesses in a litigation case where we would have to raise our hand and say, no, we totally believe that this was properly spent or issued? Or would Beth, as an example, standing on in a setting like that, have to raise her hand and give testimony that she believed firmly? I mean, would it fall back on us to state that, yes, we do believe firmly based upon whatever? Because when I look at page 3 and it says may versus shall in that statement of we may presume, if it said we shall presume, I'd be okay with that. But if it says may, then that's an open door. And in contract law, that's a big difference, a substantial difference just in the terminology used here. And that's my concern is what liability do we have as a council and a mayor and economic development, urban renewal, if we receive these dollars and it's not that clear? There's still some wiggle room.
We've been looking at that closely, and I think I'd encourage you to think about the urban renewal piece separately from the payroll piece, okay? The presumption goes to the payroll piece. It talks about presuming that payroll expenses are covered. The difficulty, and I think, Doug has pointed this out, is how far can you push that presumption? We did budget for these. Were the jobs substantially different that were actually performed by police and fire? How do you make that determination of substantially? The guidance says that this body is supposed to make a document how you're going to apply the term substantially different. And so So you've got this presumption. What I'm hearing from the governor's office and the AG's office is that you're good. You can just presume those things, and
May.
that should be fine.
We may presume.
Yes, but they're saying the presumption should be strong enough to justify these expenditures. I think everybody that has looked into this, I've had lots of emails, lots of conversations, everybody's putting their hand on the same concern on this, the police and fire component of it. And we're getting nothing but assurance from the governor's office and the AG's office, and in fairness, the Treasury guidance does seem to be pushing in this direction that it's okay. But it remains a concern for the reasons that Doug articulated and highlighted in his slide. The urban renewal piece is different because there's no presumption, it's not safety services, it's just simply revenue replacement. So my belief is that if you go through with the current program, they have created a carve out for that urban renewal reimbursement that is not CARES Act funds. And I think you'll be okay. I don't see significant liability there. The use of the CARES Act funds then would be on the police and fire. Now, to get to your question about liability, the question is going to be, in any litigation, two questions. The first one would be, were your police and fire really substantially dedicated to COVID response or not? What did they actually do, right? So you're going to have policemen in the witness stand, you're going to have a police chief in the witness stand. I would expect to see some of you, all of you potentially, trying to explain why you thought that your police and fire departments were substantially dedicated. And we will be looking very closely at that presumption, right? If it comes to that, we will be defending the action on the basis that we were entitled under Treasury guidance to make that presumption. The second question about liability has to do with whether you knowingly misappropriated the funds, and I don't think that's where we are. I simply don't think that case can be made, because we're looking carefully, we're receiving disparate guidance, we're trying to do what's right under that guidance, we're being told what this presumption means, and we're being told that the governor's program is okay. This is different than somebody saying, I'm going to purposefully and fraudulently misappropriate federal dollars. And that's not what we wouldn't be having this conversation if that was what we were doing. So.
Mayor, as a follow-up question, it just occurred to me, as we were talking about potentially the funding or not funding of fire and police labor, is it appropriate for Councilwoman Munchie to be involved in this conversation?
I believe it is.
Okay, I just
because
want
it's a
clarity, just so that the
principle,
question's
I-
been asked and answered.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's fine. Fire personnel can get paid one way or another, whether you participate or not.
Okay.
So I think it's
Correct.
Thank you.
So, I lost my question, but I'm just thinking, as I've had a number of conversations with the governor's office, and they have assured us that this is meeting the guidelines, the Attorney General, and you've mentioned this, and you've had those same discussions. And so the question in my mind is, we don't have anything in writing. But other than the Deputy Attorney General did issue a letter stating that it still had those presumptions and the word substantial. I mean, it was still there, but trying to alleviate that concern. But we don't have anything in writing but my understanding from the governor's office is that the governor's office, the state, is the one that these funds have been distributed to. If we were required to pay them back, the state is the one that would have that obligation. We are a subrecipient. Do you have any idea on that?
I have heard that from Brian Wunderlich, the governor's attorney, and from Brian Kane at the AG's office. They believe that if this program blows up, that it will be at the state level that the litigation occurs. And they have said, not in writing, they have said, we're going to kind of stand behind the program. Right? You know, we're going to get your back. I don't know how that plays out. It's not in writing. There is subrecipient liability under the the False Claims Act. So we can't know for sure that the city wouldn't be wrapped up in some litigation.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor?
Yes.
Or- Based on the language, I assume other states will also likely be possibly looking at funding or supporting the funding for similar purposes. So we may not be setting precedents. There could be a lot of folks, a lot of states who may end up in the same situation on whether they take it or they do not.
That is true. As far as I know, the governor's program that involves a tax savings component to it may be unique to Idaho, but all the cities across the country can be subrecipients or recipients of these CARES Act funds. The larger cities are direct recipients, like the state is. So they're all wrestling, you're right, they're all wrestling with this same guidance, trying to determine whether they can take this pool of money and pay for police and fire.
Mayor, follow-up? So the burden won't be on how the funds were used then to support tax relief, it's just whether it meets the criteria that seem to be set in what you,
I think
Given us.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
no,
off.
that's okay.
I think that that's true. There are questions and actually being litigated in Idaho as to whether the governor can impose these conditions on the distribution of the funds. But I don't think that's going to be a federal level issue. I don't think that it's going to touch on whether or not the ultimate expenditure of the funds was appropriate, just whether the state level can impose conditions. So I think what you've got, I think it's Boundary County is saying the conditions are inappropriate. I don't think it really addresses the issue or the decision you have this morning.
And we could follow up on the conditions that were imposed were the fact that we could not take any % of tax increase, that we stayed at 0. And I think that's the issue there. We had made that decision long before this came out. So our decision to stay at 0, and I think that's very important for our public to understand, we made a decision that we wanted to do, out of the 3% that we were allowed to take, we wanted to take 0. And that had nothing to do with this decision. It was the decision of the council ahead of this decision. And I did see an article in the paper about that and some misunderstandings regarding tax increase. We did have new construction, but out of the 3% allowable to the city, we kept it at 0. But it was not tied to any requirement with this. It was a decision we had made in advance. So, are there any other questions? Okay, Doug, go ahead, thank you.
Just a couple of thoughts for you and the council to consider. As Mark indicated, we are not the prime recipient, and as my understanding as well, the state has indicated they would bear the burden, and that's my understanding as far as it goes. He's more of the expert, but that's what I have heard as well. Secondly, I talked earlier about Meridian and other cities that have larger resource bases than we do. So I talked with my counterpart in Meridian yesterday. They indicated that their request in dollars is very similar to ours, slightly larger. If this went backwards and it passed from the prime to the subrecipient and they were asked to repay, they have the reserves to repay that. If that were us, we would have 2 options to repay. This is worst case scenario, but you need to know what it could be. If it were us, repaying the $9.2 million would virtually wipe out the general gov reserve. It would be mostly gone. Or we could do the following. We could take, in whatever year this happened, because we do not know when this might come down, but we could take our 3%, which would be $1.25 million. We could take the new construction, which is right now about $1.7 million a year. And if we used every penny of our foregone, which was $4.399 million, using the 3%, the new construction, and the foregone, would still leave us about $1 million short of repaying the $9 million. So we would have to have an extremely austere budget season and still dip into our reserves to repay this if that were to happen. So that's the worst case scenario. Now let me give you the impact to the average resident very quickly. This reduction is, let me back up. In talking with Steve Onifray, the average property valuation increase in Nampa for this year we're talking about is 20%. This particular reduction would help the benefits or help the residents by alleviating them of the need to pay that increase, and it would give them a small decrease in their taxes. So they may not see a huge savings, on their property taxes, but they wouldn't be forced to pay an increase. So they would have the benefit, and that would need to be explained. Commercial and agricultural will get bigger percentages, but the majority of the dollars will go to residential. Now, I just had a thought that kind of slipped out of my mind there for a moment. The application of these funds in this year, which would come out in the next year's assessment, would be a one-time savings. I would be remiss if I did not mention that because we would be kind of obscuring a 20% increase in valuation this year, and that the evaluation, the assessments coming out in 2022, the next year, would have 2 years of valuation increase in them, whatever the next year's would be, and that's what the assessments would be based on. So you could, if we had another 20% increase in valuation, you could theoretically see a 40% increase in valuation and a corresponding increase in taxes 2 years from now. So that's the downside. You'd have this little curve down and then a massive curve up. That's possible.
And just for clarity, I want to make sure, and I'm thinking about any citizens that might come back and listen to this. It's the assessed value that Doug
Right.
is referring to. Because even though we have taken a 0% tax increase, because the assessed values are continuing to go up at the rate they're going up, where citizens would think they would be getting a tax reprieve because we've taken 0, it's not happening. They're still seeing, and you maybe saw the article in the Statesman earlier this week, they're still seeing their taxes go up because of assessed values, not because of city spending. And so the increase would be hidden a little bit, pretty much this year, but next year would be a shocking whammy.
It'd be a turnaround.
And I will say, I was on a call yesterday with some legislators, and I asked them just some questions about this, and there was one statement that was made that I really pondered, and it was questioning the wisdom of a one-time money and the impact that it has, because it doesn't decrease. It's a one-time thing. But it doesn't impact it long-term. It all goes back to where it was, and so it can be a real misconception in one-time money.
So in conclusion, from the finance perspective and the finance perspective only, we have the issue of compliance. It's likely we'd probably receive a light slap on the wrist, but nothing that would cause us any heartburn. But that's just as where we stand right now. Mark has addressed the urban renewal. Those are the two major issues that we need to worry about because they both carry a degree of unspecified risk that we may not know the true answer to. One of the issues put to me was if at a national level we change leadership, we go from Trump to Biden, any new president for that matter, has the capacity to come back and redefine what substantially dedicated to COVID means. They can do it proactively or postscript. So they could come back and say, well, we don't think that was the correct guidance at the time. We want to change it. There's also, so that is, and has happened, a potential impact for future years. The likelihood is if this comes back, it will be several years before. I recall that audits of Katrina are still ongoing, Hurricane Katrina. That's been about 15 years ago, however long. So this could be a while coming before it returns, but it's possible for it to reduce. So my finance opinion is that we could probably make it through on the compliance piece 70-30. You know, there's 30% chance we might take something very unfortunate. The urban renewal, Mark has indicated that we can work that with the L2, and the L2 is the filing that I use to certify our assessment and our property taxes with the county. That's what it is, the L2. We do it every year. It's required statutorily. I had it delayed until next Monday before I sent it in so we could make this decision. And we would leverage the L2. It's kind of an interesting way for the state to approach it. I'm making that assumption for how the urban renewal gets paid because I still have to fund them. I still have to issue, Mark, if I'm correct, I still have to issue a check or funds to urban renewal for what they've lost, but it would be done from the perspective of saying that the L2 is pulling that from the general fund and not from the COVID-19 money. So they're making a distinction that it's pulling from the general fund and the COVID-19 money to treat it differently. So that's the aspect that I cannot speak to, but it is a risk.
Doug, I have a question for you. And in your conversations with Canyon County, if Nampa were the only city to participate and Canyon County is not, our taxes and all of that information comes from the county. I would think, I'm just questioning the burden that that would put on the county to be issuing that for one city when the rest of the cities in the county are not.
Well, in a meeting I attended about a month and a half ago down at Canyon County, the treasurer and the clerks were really struggling with the computational challenges of adding this into the systems. Follow-up conversations with Steve Onifray indicated they can handle it, but it would be burdensome because let's say we're the only city to do this. It means he's got to run two different parallel processes, one for people who don't do this and one for people who do. So he's essentially doubling his workload. And there always is the potential for error whenever the more workload you add, the more calculations you have to run, the potential for error is there. The county says they can handle it, but it is a substantial increase in workload for this year and next year, because next year they have to reverse it all.
Are there any other questions for Doug?
Mayor Kling?
Yes.
Just for the sake of the new council members, I would remind them that foregone dollars are tax dollars that haven't been received.
Correct.
So for the collection to take place of foregone dollars, that would have to come out of the pockets of the taxpayers at the point in time where they're collected. So whatever that value is, $4 million, that's sitting there available, it's only available by the statute, but it's still, it would be taking dollars out of the people's pockets that need to have those dollars remain in their pockets. So, and then you're talking about additionally above and beyond that, 3% potential taxation, all that in an effort to try to get back what we gave them.
Right, exactly.
Once that money's gone, that would be almost impossible to get back. And I would state too that if the state is the primary target, if the government comes back and says, hey, again, you're hypothetical if the Democratic Party wins the presidency in November, if that were to take place, the second target would be the largest cities in the state, which we would be either second or third at that point in population. So we would be a target as well. My understanding in talking to the commissioners in Canyon County and potential, their recollection of what the city of Caldwell chose is that they couldn't feel confident in standing before a judge saying, yes, we feel comfortable in knowing that we did everything right. Because they didn't feel that they could, they chose not to accept those dollars. So that's the risk. In my business, it's a limitation of, you try to limit liability as much as you can. Risk is a major component of what I deal with. So I have a concern about the accepting of potentially a bitter pill that is going to hurt us long term. So that's just a thought that I'd share. Again, more on the foregone for the new council members.
And that foregone cannot be used without a resolution.
Yes, I think that must be Sandy that has a comment or question.
Yes, ma'am. I have a question, and Doug, hopefully you can clear this up. And Councilman Haverfield, I do appreciate you bringing up the attention of the foregone taxes because that's so easily understood. And along that questioning, since we as a council have voted to do away with our foregone taxes for the last few years, how does that come into play to us as a city? Because we would not be able to recall those foregone taxes.
Well, if it were to come into play, it would be through a resolution brought before the council to do so. Now, we are not required to use it in this instance. We could pull the entire value from reserves. As I indicated, there were two options on how we could treat that shortfall. But I imagine that using foregone would require substantial debate and discussion before we got to a decision on that.
And Sandy, we currently have 4.5 million in foregone.
4.4.
We did not, and the law changed this year, and unless we voted to take the 3% and put it into foregone, it automatically did not go.
Right, it was automatically
So
disclaimed.
we automatically did not hang on to those funds for foregone, and so we are limited to 4.5 million, that's all we've got.
Yep,
Well, and Mayor, as a reminder, we can only, in the past years, we could only limit the use of the foregone taxes of that year's budget. So the monies that could have been gathered in prior years still was retained. So again, when you talk about $4 million, that's what's available to us from prior years.
right. The aggregate value.
Right, and so again, it's tax dollars that weren't collected, that if you tried to collect them at that point, then we'd probably be recalled as a council and the mayor, so. Yeah. Just,
The only benefit I see to using foregone in the future is once the GO bond is paid off, and then using foregone up to the extent of the GO bond would not increase the burden on the taxpayers. But that's not till 2024.
right, the urban renewal.
Councilwoman Levi, did you have any follow-up questions?
No, thank you. And again, I appreciate the reiteration because it gets so commonly misunderstood that $4.5 million for our taxpayers and new council people's benefit is not sitting in a pot somewhere waiting to be spent. It would be taken directly from the taxpayers. And that's such a vital piece of information. We have to make sure we're stressing to our taxpayers and that we understand as a council, because this is a very serious thing. This is not only money that we would have to be taking from the taxpayers in addition to what would be taken out of a general gov fund if that was the option we decided to go.
Yep.
So it's a very serious and a costly decision that we have to make today. Thank you.
One more thing I wanted to add. I had a discussion after talking with Mark yesterday. I talked with Beth Einig, and I asked her just for clarity, what if we did not pass the money to urban renewal, the $600,000? What would be the consequence to them? Because we're talking about the legality. Is it revenue replacement? State says no. Some requirements say yes. They could still, my main concern was I'm not advocating this. This is simply an avenue that we could pursue if we chose to. But they would be able to make their debt payments, but it would substantially hamper their urban renewal projects this year and next, if that were the case. But that is technically an option you could consider.
Because we are in both that we're present here and online, I'd like to pause and ask if Councilman Brunner or Councilman Bauer have any comments or questions, because it's kind of hard for them to jump in. So, any questions?
Mayor, I don't have any questions.
Comments?
I'm in favor of actually accepting this money. My only concern was I wish there was more than just verbal documentation. I would have appreciated some written documentation, but hopefully we can trust our Attorney General and Governor and that body and the Treasury. So that's all. I have no questions. I appreciate Councilman Haverfield's question and I realize his concern. I think with the state securing and taking most of the brunt of the liability, I am okay in accepting this. I wish Canyon County was also.
Thank you, Mayor.
And Councilman Bauer, do you have any comments or questions?
Thank you, Mayor. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm really torn on this. I kind of see where Councilman Brunner is, and I also see the other side of the argument. And I know some people very intelligent see this as a way to lower our taxes. And who wouldn't want to lower our taxes for a county in an area that has really high property taxes as it is? So it is a very difficult decision. I also see the other side where it is a risk, and that risk would come back to hurt that same taxpayer if it were to come back and bite us. So I'm just listening to my fellow councilman and mayor, and I'm kind of digesting all this and researching it, and I am torn, but I'm listening and still have being open-minded, but I do have some very serious concerns about this, and I think it is a major risk.
Mayor Kling.
Yes.
Good morning, Jacob. Thank you, sir. I agree with you 100%. But I would like a little clarity here. So since Caldwell and Canyon County are not accepting this program, these funds, I don't know what Middleton will do, or Wilder or Melba, how is that going to affect the city of Nampa taxpayers next year and the next year after that?
Well, as I indicated, this year, or for the assessments to go out in November of this year, they would see the decrease, or in the worst case scenario, they would not see an increase. The year after that, they would see a twofold increase. You would have the increase this year that wasn't taxed, the valuation, plus whatever valuation took place next year. So, like I say, last year, 2 years ago when I first started, the increase was 16%. This year it's 20%. So let's say it goes back to 16. That means they could be faced with a 36% increase in 2 years on their property tax valuations.
So, and that's, if I could, Mayor, and that's what you're referring to as 20% this year, and another 20 next year would be 40%. Depending also, what we haven't discussed, is what the state legislator does with their property taxes.
Yes.
And so that would be the other issue. So in a nutshell, is this a real benefit for us? That's the big
From a
question.
finance perspective, it is a very, very minor benefit without a lot of gain, but a fair amount of risk. I'm sorry, that's just the finance perspective. Don't take it for anything more than that, but that's just the reality.
Well, it appears like you throw up a coin and hopefully it lands on heads.
Yeah.
Heads being acceptance of the CARES
Yeah.
program. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Doug.
Are there any other comments or questions? Okay. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
So needless to say, we have a question before us. And you know what I so appreciate about our council is that we give this all very strong consideration because we recognize the responsibility we have and the impact of a decision. And so it is a difficult decision because we do want to do what's right for our taxpayers. But as Doug said, there is an element of risk. And Doug, thank you for sharing your perspective based on finance.
Mayor, I would like to make a motion.
Okay?
I would like to make a motion that we do not accept the CARES Act funding because I think the substantial benefit does not potentially outweigh the substantial potential risk.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Is there discussion? Okay, seeing none, roll call.
Mayor?
Up.
Mayor?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I couldn't get it unmuted. I appreciate the motion, and I reiterate what several of our council members, our mayor, and I believe our finance director and our legal have expressed. We have risks one way or another, and let me even digress a little bit more. Doug and Mark, I appreciate the time you have dedicated to searching out this subject and understanding the importance of this subject and the long-term effect that it will have on our taxpayers and explaining it with such clarity to council. My comment is this, and the reason I support this motion is in the long-term picture, one way or another, this will affect the taxpayers. This money coming from the federal government to our states is created money. It is not money that is sitting there. So in one form or another, the taxpayer is going to be making up the difference whether we accept this money at a state and city level or we choose not to, because the debt's going to have to be paid off in one form or another. When I look at the risk to the city, there are too many unknown risks, and while I would like to see property tax relief for our citizens and for myself, this is something the assessments have to be taken to the state level, and we have to have our legislators look into a different formula of how our tax assessments
are done and putting a hold that way. This is not something that the federal government's going to fix for us. This is just another Band-Aid approach. And so I hope that our citizens as well as ourselves will be stirred to go to our legislators and demand a reform in how our tax assessments are figured out in the future.
Thank you,
Councilwoman
Councilman Levi. Are there any other comments before roll call?
Mayor, just make one comment. Good
Comments
comments
by Councilwoman Levi. I'm still voting with no on this motion because I really feel like our businesses, commercial, et cetera, have taken a huge hit. And even though this has a chance of increasing 2 years from now in 2022, their taxes, any type of relief where it's not going to be additional is important. And I just feel like even though it's temporary, immediate relief and care and concern for our businesses and property taxes needs to be our top priority. So sounds like I'm going to lose on this one, but anyway, I will be voting no.
Okay, thank you, Councilman Bruner. Are there any other comments? Seeing none, roll call.
Rodriguez?
Yes.
Bruner?
No.
Levi?
Yes?
Bauer?
Yes.
Haverfield?
Yes. Yes.
Mucci?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to say thank you to the council. Thank you both to Mark Hilty Legal, Doug Racine, for your comments and sharing with us. And I just want to say thank you to the council, because I know this is a difficult decision, but we've taken it very, very seriously and really pondered through it. So thank you for your deliberation and all the discussion today. It's been good. So, yes.
I would say too that it's been helpful to know and to be able to get the value of talking to other jurisdictions that have made this same decision and the processing that they went through and helped them in their decisions as well.
Yes.
So that's been helpful.
And Mayor,
Yes.
I think to echo what Councilman Levi said, we all want property tax relief, but for me personally, I just feel the burden of proof is too high. The if and it would wipe us out. And I think that risk just is not something that we can take on behalf of our citizens. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, as I've read from other communities, one of the reasons why they've not moved forward has to do with truth and transparency. And can we, with a very clear conscience, say that the substantial portion of our police was used for COVID relief? And we've tracked our COVID relief. We know that we've spent 3,000 hours educating with our police. We know the work that has been done. And it's very difficult to then turn and say, yes, a substantial piece, when we have tracked it and we know what those numbers are. And so the integrity of it is difficult. It puts us in a difficult position. I do want to say that this vote in no way is a reflection on our governor. I appreciate his intent. And there's an incredible team at the governor's office that has done an excellent job through this process, and that this vote in no way is a negative reflection on what their intent was here. So, but I think it is wise that we're in keeping with our county. And so, thank you.
Mayor, and kudos to you and to the council and to our city leaders for posturing us in a position physically that we're not in a position where we could really be tempted to take this and run with it because of poor fiscal stewardship. I think the city's done a great job of posturing ourselves in a position where we could take on this crisis, to not have to increase our budget this year accordingly, and we're still moving forward. So kudos to you and to your team.
Thank you. So the next item on our agenda is an executive session, and I would like to ask for a motion to adjourn into executive session pursuant to Idaho Code 7420618 to consider hiring a public officer, employee, staff member, or individual agent wherein the respective qualities are to be evaluated in order to fill a vacancy or need.
I'll make the motion, Mayor.
Second.
All in favor? Roll
Aye.
call. I'm sorry.
Brunner,
Yes, here.
Mucci,
I was moving.
Yes.
Levi,
Yes.
Bauer,
Yes.
Haverfield,
Yes.
Rodriguez.
Yes.